Hi everybody and welcome to our Apprenticeship Service webinar today. We're going to be looking at the key changes to the Apprenticeship Funding Rules for 2025 to 2026 and our session today is for employers and for training providers. My name's Nick Duff from the Service Engagement team and I'll be doing the hosting for today's session. So moving on to our presenters, I'm joined today by quite a big gang. I've got John Myers, Laura Orritt-Hopkins, Karen Clark, Laverne Darling and Gary Mitchell who will be doing the main input on the key changes. And then I've also got Charlotte Whittle and Ambrish Patel who are going to pitch in on the Q&A panel as well. So big welcome to all of you guys. So that's enough for me. I think we're ready to start. So John, if you don't mind, I'm going to hand over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for your time today. I'm John Myers, Head of Apprenticeship Funding Policy here at DFE. I'd like to start by thanking the team for all the hard work in preparing both the rules but also the legislation changes. The team also is responsible for changing legislation to enable shorter and foundation apprenticeships to happen. This year has seen a lot of change in apprenticeships. And we think it's particularly important for this session to be going ahead today so we can explain some of the changes in a bit more detail to you. Obviously, we've created foundation apprenticeships, shorter duration apprenticeships. There's been changes around off-the-job training, changes to English and maths, quite a lot of change to the sector. Because of the pace of change this year, we weren't able to do as we normally would, which is to issue a draft set of rules in March. Instead, what we did was we made sure that we were able to try and ensure the rules were as good and tight as possible through working very closely with our partners, AELP, UVAC, AOC, and a group of expert providers as well, who helped us to ensure that the rules are as clear as they can possibly be. Today, though, is the next step in ensuring those rules are as clear as they possibly can be. And the questions that you're asking today will help us to see where we need to clarify things. And we will look to clarify things as soon as we can. If there's something really important, we'll look to clarify that before the 1st of August. But I would certainly expect that we will be making a further update to the rules, not least because obviously of the recent announcement about level 7 apprenticeships. Then we'll need to make an update in the autumn ahead of implementation of the changes around level 7 in January. So thank you again to the team, and at this point I'll hand you over to Laura.
Thank you, John. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So my name is Laura Orritt-Hopkins, and I'm one of the senior managers on the Apprenticeship Funding Policy team here at DFE, and I lead on the overall production and publication of the Apprenticeship Funding Rules. So as Nick and John have said, we're going to be using this session to talk through some of the key changes to the 25-26 rules, and I'll be joined by some of my colleagues to talk through the changes. Before we go into the detail of the changes, though, I wanted to start by giving a bit of an overview of our approach to the work on the rules for 25-26. As you'll be aware, in February this year, a number of announcements were made to support the aims of increasing flexibility and simplifying the system. And these included the introduction of new products, so shorter apprenticeships and foundation apprenticeships, and also the reform of apprenticeship assessment plans. So therefore, the rules for 25-26 needed to reflect these. And so as John alluded to in his introduction, to enable us to include the full policy detail, we decided, as previously communicated on gov.uk, not to issue a draft version of the rules in March. And that being said, as John also mentioned, it's important to say that we have worked with a range of stakeholders who've helped us to make the initial changes and the further developments and clarifications. And these include the Association of Colleges, the Association of Employment and Learning Providers, and the University Vocational Awards Council, as well as our expert provider group. And we thank them for all of their contributions and feedback to this work. So on the 15th of May, we published version 1 of the rules on gov.uk. And as always, changes we've made are highlighted in the accompanying summary of changes document that's also available on gov.uk. In terms of the format for this year's webinar, we'll follow what we did last year. So instead of going through the summary of changes in detail, we're going to focus on the key issues and changes to provide more context and rationale for the changes that we've made. This does mean, though, that this webinar will not cover every single change, and therefore we'd strongly recommend that you refer to the summary of changes and full funding rules documents if you haven't already done so. So this slide here just highlights the main changes that we've made for 25-26, and we'll cover all of these in more detail in a moment. But again, you can see how these areas, many of these, reflect the operational detail of the new products and announcements that were made previously. So the first change that we wanted to highlight is around support for English and maths training. So following the introduction of flexibilities around English and maths for apprentices aged 19 plus at the start of their apprenticeship training, we've introduced the concept of active learning for English and maths, and also made some further clarifications on the back of feedback that we've received from the sector. So we've made it a mandatory requirement for all those apprentices who are studying English and maths as part of their apprenticeship programme to carry out active learning in line with their signed training plan. And this is to ensure that funds for English and maths are used as intended, and also to ensure that auditors have tangible evidence that they can carry out their checks against. So the key question here then is, do we expect English and maths active learning to take place every calendar month, as with the off-the-job training active learning? And it's important to say really that English and maths active learning is separate to off-the-job training active learning, and those two are no longer linked. So we've defined this in the glossary section, which comes at the back of the funding rules document. So the way in which English and maths active learning differs is that it's based on the delivery recorded in the signed training plan at the start of the programme. So for example, if there's a 16 to 18-year-old apprentice or a 19-plus-year-old apprentice who's been opted into studying English and maths during the initial assessment process, the frequency of delivery must be recorded in the training plan, and this is then going to be signed by the provider, the employer, and the apprentice. So if the training plan, for instance, states that delivery will take place in, say, months 1, 3 and 5 of the programme, providers must record the evidence of this taking place during those months as part of the evidence pack, and this can then be checked by auditors. Further to this, we've also clarified some other key areas following feedback from a range of stakeholders. So firstly, on initial assessment, we've clarified that the initial assessment is really the driver for the discussion around apprentices who are aged 19 plus and whether they are to be opted in or out of English and maths. And as part of this, if the apprentice opts out, it's no longer mandatory for them to undertake the diagnostic assessment portion of the initial assessment, and nor do they need to provide evidence of prior attainment. In terms of employer responsibilities, we've also clarified that it is ultimately the employer's decision to opt their apprentice, who's aged 19 plus, in or out of English and or maths. And just in terms of DFE funding, we've further clarified that no other funding can be used to fund English and maths training whilst the apprentice is on programme. And this includes adult skills funding, which would be considered as a double funding. So I'll now hand over to Karen, who's going to talk about the new apprenticeship minimum duration and changes to off-the-job training.
Thanks, Laura. Like Laura, I'm one of the other senior managers on the funding policy team. So just in terms of minimum duration then, so the key change to this section of the funding rules is really about the upcoming change in law to the statutory minimum duration. So right now, as you all know, the minimum duration of an apprenticeship is 12 months. But from August this year, so from the 1st of August, this will change to 8 months. So the legislation for this change has now been laid, but it is important just to note two things. First, the change doesn't come into effect until the 1st of August. So I just want to be really clear about that. If you're still recruiting learners and their start date is up until the 31st of July, even though we've announced this change that it's coming, that change to the 8 months doesn't start until the 1st of August. So the minimum requirement would still be a 12-month programme. Secondly, the change does only affect new starts from the 1st of August. So any continuing learners, any restarts, they won't be covered by the minimum duration change. So just bear that in mind, please. I just want to give you some context to the change, because a lot of people have kind of asked, why 8 months? Why did we make that change now? So the rationale for making the change was twofold, really. So the first one really was about bringing in more learners. So people who are currently ineligible, bringing them into scope for learning. So widening the pool of learners that we can fund through the programme. But we also wanted to give learners and employers greater flexibility about how long their programmes last. And that's the key word here, it's flexibility. And that's essentially what this is. It is a delivery flexibility. And it's really up to providers to decide whether this change, the change from 12 months to 8 months, really has any impact at all on the programmes that they deliver. For a lot of providers, because of what they deliver, sort of longer programmes or how they deliver it, this change might not have much impact at all. So we're certainly not expecting programmes to suddenly all be delivered in 8 months, the same way that we don't expect all programmes to currently now be delivered in 12 months. Just for a lot of standards, that just isn't practical. So we're certainly not expecting that wholesale change. It's really up to you guys, working with your employers, to decide whether this really has much impact at all on what you deliver and how you deliver things. But I have put some scenarios on the slide that or scenarios that would benefit immediately from the change. So the first one is obviously learners with prior learning, where the extent of their prior learning would currently take them below the current 12-month minimum. So we've obviously got a lot of 12-month or level 2 standards where if somebody has prior learning, it effectively rules them ineligible, almost straight away. But obviously with that change from the 1st of August, we could fund them, providing that their prior learning doesn't take them below the new 8-month minimum duration, or it's 187-hour off the job equivalent. So that's the first kind of group that's going to immediately benefit from this change. The second group really is where we want to develop shorter programs. And so by that, I mean programs that have got less content than what we would currently sort of need now. So typically, for example, obviously the new foundation apprenticeships are starting to kind of be rolled out. They will typically last around 8 months and have less off-the-job training in them. And if this minimum duration change hadn't been made, then it wouldn't have been possible to develop that type of program. So that's the second kind of group I wanted to talk about. Just on the third bullet point there, I just want to kind of mention condensed delivery models. So right now we know that a lot of providers and employers would like to deliver their training in a more condensed way, perhaps by doing more block or front loading. And right now, you obviously can't go below the 12-month minimum duration. The person has to be there for a minimum of 12 months. But from August, you can obviously adapt your programs and further compress your delivery if you want to, as long as obviously it's practical to do so. It's worth saying, though, that this change and the increase that we're generally seeing in compressed models isn't about or shouldn't be about delivering less training overall. It's just about delivering training in a different way. So, for example, by delivering more training per week, but over a shorter duration, or by front loading, or by doing some block training. Just want to finish off this slide by saying that really the change to the minimum duration to 8 months was one of the main drivers for the big review of off-the-job training that we undertook last year. And that leads me nicely on to the off-the-job changes that we've made in the funding rules. So we could just move on to those slides, please. So I'm just going to do the headline changes, and then I'll go over each one individually on the following slides. So on off the job, we've made the following 3 main changes, and this is all for new starts from the 1st of August. So number 1, we published a minimum off the job figure for each standard. So that effectively replaces the need for the provider to calculate what the minimum requirement is for each learner. We've removed the delivery link between off-the-job training and the learner's time on programs. This has changed too. So what that means really for providers is that providers are now free to deliver the required off-the-job training hours over whatever time frame they choose. Obviously, that's subject to meeting the minimum duration rule and agreeing that time frame with the employer, but there is certainly more flexibility now in when you choose to deliver training. And lastly, there's been a change of approach to part-time learners. So that means that providers will no longer need to automatically extend the duration for this group of learners. So those three changes were all really about bringing the policy up to date and trying to simplify it. Because off-the-job training is a policy in its current format that's been around for about 8 years now, but the programme has changed quite a lot over that period, and we needed to sort of bring the off-the-job policy up to date and sort of in line with the changes that have happened. Specifically, as well as trying to simplify the policy, the three changes that I've just gone through were really designed to do a number of things. So firstly, to lower the risk of audit error. We get a lot of audit errors, particularly around the calculation. Also, we wanted to reduce the administration ask of providers. Again, that's mainly linked to the first change in terms of the calculation and why we've moved to a minimum off-the-job figure for each standard. We also wanted to allow for increased flexibility in the delivery of training, so that's kind of what change 2 is about, and also improve the learner experience as well. So whilst we've had some feedback on some of the off-the-job volumes on specific named standards, which is really number 1 on the slide, the actual 3 changes themselves have been really well received, and you know, happy to still receive feedback on that if you don't think that. But generally the feedback we've had about the changes per se have landed really well. Just move on to the next slide, please. So I just want to say a little bit more about change 1, about the new off-the-job minimum requirement that we've published for each standard, because arguably that's probably the biggest of the 3 changes that I've just talked about. We have produced some support and information for these changes, which hopefully some of you have now seen. It's about 5 pages long, and it's in the form of a sort of a Q&A type document. And it specifically talks about the 3 changes and goes into a little bit more detail specifically on this change about the off-the-job hours. If you haven't seen this document yet, we have included this information in the webinar handout, and Nick will tell you how to access that later. I don't plan on going through the Q&A in that document, because you will obviously be able to sort of download that and have a look at that if you haven't already seen it. But I do want to draw out a few key points based on kind of the questions generally we've been asked about this change. So the first point is about the information that we used to set the requirement in the first place. So what we used was we looked at the actual hours data, and the data set that we used was the R14 from the last full year's data that we had, so 23-24, and that was just for completed learners who didn't have any prior learning. And the reason we did that was that we didn't want the data to be skewed by prior learning or by non-completers. So it was a reduced data set that we used. Where we did have completers in the data set, we set the new minimum off-the-job requirement below the midpoint. And what I mean by midpoint is that we use the median value for the standard. So the actual hours median value is what we used. And we set the off-the-job requirement below that midpoint. And often it was well below the midpoint, depending on the range of delivery data we had for the standard. So for each standard, we've got quite a range of how providers are delivering that standard in terms of how many hours are being returned. Some standards have a bigger range than others, which is why the sort of the off-the-job minimum requirement varies for each standard. Where we had no completers in the data set, though, we defaulted to using the IFA typical duration and its off-the-job sort of equivalent. So for a 12-month typical duration, it would be 278 hours. For 24 months, it would be 557 hours, and so on. As you know, all of this information, the off-the-job requirement for each standard, is now in Annex C of the funding rules. So it's a separate document, but it's labelled up as Annex C when we refer to it in the rules document. Obviously, every time we get a new batch of standards from IFATE, every time we approve a new batch of standards, either new ones, complete new ones or revised ones, we're going to essentially need to keep that Annex C up to date and keep republishing it, which is why we've kept it separate from the main rules document. Ultimately, the aim is to hand this work over to Skills England as soon as possible, now that they're up and running, and therefore the off-the-job hours will be published on the front of every standard. So in future, that's where we would look for this information to be held. But obviously, for now, it's in Annex C as a bit of a temporary measure. The second point I want to make is that we do recognise that some standards may need to be further revised. So the ones where we've published a figure, we're in discussion with sector representatives on a handful of standards about that figure being potentially too high, even though it has been set below the average point. That there are, because it's a big standard, it has a lot of completers. it has had a bit more of an effect on some standards than others. So where we are in that discussion with sector reps, we will confirm any changes as soon as possible. Also, for those with no completer information, where we've defaulted to using the IFATE typical duration, as was, so obviously Skills England typical duration now, it's been suggested that some of these are too long, which means that the off-the-job equivalent value that we've used is too high. So we have committed to looking at some of those as well. And it may well be that we need to take a different approach to those standards, the ones that we didn't have completer information for. So we're happy to discuss any particular standard offline, particularly those that didn't have completer information in the ILR, so that we can better understand how those programmes are being delivered. All I would say though is, for the purposes of this webinar, it would be really good if you don't ask questions on the hours for specific standards, because obviously the answer isn't going to apply to everybody that's on the call, and we've got a lot of people on the call. So generic questions, really happy to answer. Anything specific that's related just to one standard, if you could continue to feed in them through your sector representatives, so ALP, it will say UVAC, that's who we've been working with on those queries. So that would be really appreciated. Thank you. Just on the next change, so this is the second change that I mentioned, which was about the removal of the delivery link between the off-the-job hours and the duration. So right now, as you know, those two things go hand in hand. So if the apprentice is on programme for, say, 12 months, then what our auditors are looking for essentially is a minimum of 278 hours, or 20%, 6 hours a week of their time. But if they were there for 15 months, then the auditors would be looking for 348 hours, and so on and so forth. That part of the policy, that link about the two things going hand in hand, that was really developed back in the day, sort of 7-8 years ago, you know, when off-the-job training in its current format was kind of developed, and the majority of apprenticeships were delivered in a day release fashion. So by that, what I mean is pretty much, you know, a pretty standard amount of training was being delivered each week to apprentices. So typically if the apprentice was there for longer, it was because more training was being delivered, and vice versa. So it made sense at the time for those two things really to go hand in hand. You know, if you were there longer, more training was being delivered, etc., etc. But, you know, now we've got so many different ways of delivering programs, so face-to-face, online, we've got different delivery models, you know, compressed, front load and block release. It no longer really makes sense to retain that link. So as part of the kind of review that we did into the programme, we looked at this and we decided that removing the link would increase the flexibility in how training could be delivered. So what that means really is that providers are free essentially to deliver the off-the-job hours over whatever time frame they choose. So it doesn't have to go hand in hand with how long the person is on the programme for. Obviously, you still need to meet the minimum duration rule, so 8 months from the 1st of August. And obviously you do need to agree that time frame with the employer, because it will form part of the training plan. But the important thing is, if the duration on programme increases or decreases, there won't be an impact on the off-the-job hours that we're looking for you to evidence. So the published hours for each standard, or reduced figure for RPL, is what we expect that learner to receive as a minimum, and that would be irrespective of their time on programme. So that's the really big change now for this part of the policy. Hopefully you will have seen though that we have developed a lookup table that's part of Annex C of the funding rules. So the document where we've got all of the hours, on the next tab along, there's a bit of a lookup table, and that illustrates various combinations of off the job and person's time on programme. So for example, if the requirement of the standard was 278 hours, what the lookup table essentially shows you is that you can deliver that over 12 months, and that would average 6 hours a week. But you could also deliver that over 8 months if you wanted to compress delivery, but that would mean you'd have to deliver 9 hours per week, or have some sort of front load or block release built into it. So there's various ways you can deliver a programme now, and that lookup table is there really to sort of aid that discussion. And the final slide on off-the-job training is just around part-time learners. And you know, I know, because obviously we've done these webinars before, I know providers have asked for this to be looked at for a long time now, and we did look at it again when we did the full review of the policy area. And just to be clear, this change is about no longer needing to automatically extend the duration. So some part-time apprentices will absolutely still benefit from an extended programme, and a lot of that will depend on what their working hours are. But we were getting a lot of feedback from people about part-time apprentices doing, working for say 25 hours a week, and actually they were doing the same as their full-time equivalent in terms of training. So that's why we've made this change. So it's about no longer needing to automatically extend the duration. So I just want to make that clear. Obviously, what we still want you to do and what we've put in the funding rules is that we still want you to consider the apprentices' working hours when setting the programme length, because really it's important that training expectations and how much they're being asked to do compared to their productive day job are still realistic. So that's the final change in the off-the-job section. So I'm now going to hand over to Gary, and that's to talk about foundation apprenticeships.
Thanks, Karen, and hello everyone. I'm Gary Mitchell from the Apprenticeship Funding team, and I lead on allocating funding for apprenticeships, working with i8 and now Skills England. Just to flag that I'm covering for colleagues who can't make the call, unfortunately, so I'm working from a script, but please add any questions and we'll pick them up. The Foundation Apprenticeship section of the funding rules covers those aspects which differ from other apprenticeship programmes. For elements not covered in this section, please refer to the relevant sections throughout the funding rules document. Foundation apprenticeships provide a broad curriculum which focuses on the knowledge and skills needed for the job, as well as employability skills and behaviours which support the transition from full-time education to work. Foundation apprenticeships provide entry-level competence. So, who is eligible for a foundation apprenticeship? The age criteria is different to that on other apprenticeship programmes. As mentioned, foundation apprenticeships support the transition from education to work, so these are aimed at younger learners. The slide shows the learner eligibility criteria. For apprentices aged between 22 and 24, providers must ensure that the apprentice is informed that their employer will be made aware that they will either have an education, health and care plan, have been or are in the care of the local authority, or are a prisoner or have been in prison. Where apprentices don't give consent to share this information with their employer, they must not be placed on a foundation apprenticeship, as employers will automatically know that they fall within one of these categories. Providers should look at other apprenticeships, i.e. a non-foundation apprenticeship, which enables information about EHC plans and care leaver status to remain confidential. As with all apprenticeship programmes, providers will need to undertake an initial assessment. This includes, but is not limited to, ensuring a foundation apprenticeship is the most suitable for the learner, as well as recognising any prior learning. Like any apprenticeship, we will fund an individual to undertake a foundation apprenticeship which is at the same or lower level than a qualification they already hold. However, this is only if the foundation apprenticeship allows the individual to acquire significant new learning, that the training content is materially different, and that the minimum duration is still met. An individual may be eligible to complete more than one foundation apprenticeship as long as the remaining training needed after recognition of prior learning, which includes the employability skills, meets the minimum apprenticeship duration, which will be 8 months. However, we would not expect to see many instances of this happening. Where an individual has taken part in a foundation apprenticeship and they progress onto another apprenticeship, then prior learning will need to be assessed as part of the initial assessment for the further apprenticeship. Where this has been identified, the content, price and duration of the apprenticeship must be amended, with the remaining learning again meeting the minimum duration. Next slide, please. English and maths requirements for 16 to 18-year-olds who are on foundation apprenticeships are different to other apprenticeship programs. For foundation, where the individual does not hold English and/or maths at either a level 1 or level 2, they must start and continue to study for the relevant level as detailed in the first and second bullets. The difference to other apprenticeship programs is that they do not need to achieve their English and/or maths prior to completing their foundation apprenticeship. However, where providers deem it appropriate, for example, the apprentice is ready to take and pass the test, the assessment can be taken. So, why don't foundation apprenticeships need to achieve their English and/or maths? Due to the substantial technical knowledge, skills and behaviours and wider employability skills that need to be secured in a relatively short space of time, it would not be right to expect foundation apprentices to achieve a standalone qualification in every case on top of their apprenticeship, or to hold them back from progression if they have successfully completed their core training. Individuals aged 16 to 18 on a foundation apprenticeship will instead have a minimum number of guided learning hours similar to other FE programs for young people aged 16 to 18. This minimum number of guided learning hours is set at 55 hours per subject. This is in addition to the hours required for the off-the-job training. As with other apprenticeship programs, providers must ensure that active learning for English and/or maths takes place in line with the signed training plan. The only exception to the 55 hours is where it has been identified within the initial assessment that due to prior knowledge, the learning requires less than 55 guided learning hours in order to be ready to take and pass the assessments. In these circumstances, this must be documented on their training plan. The government continues to be committed to ensure that all young people post-16 should have the opportunity to secure a level 2 qualification in English and maths. Apprentices who progress from a foundation apprenticeship onto another apprenticeship, a non-foundation apprenticeship, will need to meet the English and/or maths requirements of the latter apprenticeship. In other words, they will need to achieve. The flexibility over whether apprentices aged 19 plus study towards English and/or maths remains. Details of this can be found in the support for English and maths training section. Next slide, please. Thanks. Moving on to the final slide for foundation apprenticeship, this covers the employer incentives. The employer incentive payment is to support employers with the additional costs of taking on a young person on an eligible foundation apprenticeship. This is extra funding in addition to the £1,000 additional payment to recognise the additional costs for the recruitment, retention and progression of foundation apprentices. We will clearly mark on the foundation apprenticeship standard as to whether it will be eligible for the employer incentive payment. And you can see the example text on the slide, which will appear on eligible standards. The incentive will be paid in 3 instalments. 2 payments will be made across the duration of the foundation apprenticeship, with the final payment being made when the apprentice completes and progresses onto their next apprenticeship. The slide details the dates these payments will be generated on. Payments will be made via the provider, which is the same process as the £1,000 additional payment. With regards to the progression payment, this is only paid if the apprentice, upon completion of their foundation apprenticeship, starts a new apprenticeship, which is not a foundation apprenticeship, within 6 months of their completion date and they remain with the same employer. By this we mean where they stay on the same employer's Apprenticeship Service account. This is to recognise the commitment of the employer retaining the apprentice after their foundation apprenticeship has ended, and along with continuing to support their progression. The payment will be generated 90 days after the apprentice's learning start date. Please note that any break in learning will impact the dates that these payments are generated. Payments will be delayed until the apprentice resumes their apprenticeship and has reached an overall total of 90 or 242 days in learning. Where there is a change of employer whilst the apprentice is on their foundation apprenticeship programme, then please refer to the Change in Circumstances section within the Foundation Apprenticeship section. And those are the slides on foundation apprenticeships, and I'm now going to talk about the changes to additional payments. Thank you. This slide covers the additional payments that are paid to employers, providers and care leaver apprentices who meet the relevant criteria. Firstly, additional payments for employers and providers. Just to note that this £1,000 additional payment will also be paid for those eligible learners who are on foundation apprenticeships. The only change that we have made is regarding the final instalment date for those on a foundation apprenticeship or with a shorter duration apprenticeship. By this we mean an apprenticeship with a published typical duration of less than 12 months. In these 2 instances, the final instalment of the additional payment will be generated 242 days after the apprentice's learning start date instead of 365 days. This ensures the provider and employer does not miss out receiving the full additional payment when the apprenticeship is being completed within the expected timescale. It's important to note that if the apprentice is on an apprenticeship standard where the published typical duration is 12 months or more, but they complete their apprenticeship in less than 12 months, then the final instalment will not be made. So, what do we mean by published typical duration? Each apprenticeship standard shows a typical duration, as shown on the image on the right-hand side of the slide. This gives providers an indication of the typical length of the programme. This duration has been determined by evidence supported by trailblazer groups and approved by the Institute's approval committee. It's important to note that providers are still able to agree a different duration with the employer, subject to meeting the minimum duration. From 1st of August 2025, this duration will no longer be linked to the number of off-the-job hours that need to be delivered to be eligible for funding. Providers should refer to the off-the-job training minimum requirement for each apprenticeship standards document, which details the number of off-the-job hours required for each standard in order to comply with the off-the-job training policy, which Karen talked through earlier. Moving on to the care leaver bursary payments, again, this covers those eligible learners who are on a foundation apprenticeship. As with the additional payments for employers and providers, we have amended the final instalment date to be day 242 for those on a foundation apprenticeship or a shorter duration apprenticeship with a published typical duration of less than 12 months. Throughout the last year, we have received feedback on the care leaver bursary section, so we have taken the opportunity to clarify the rules further. This includes confirming that the care leaver bursary covers those apprentices that are still in care, and that the care leaver bursary is tax-free and is not treated as income for universal credit. Within the outcome of this initial assessment section, we have clarified that providers must give learners the opportunity to declare their eligibility for the care leavers bursary if the apprentice is aged 24 or younger. This bursary recognises that care leavers often face additional financial barriers. They are likely to be living independently and without family support. Therefore, the bursary provides additional financial support to help them access and complete apprenticeships. We want to ensure that claims are made at the start of the apprenticeship, so that these payments can be made on the published dates. However, we do understand that there may be some instances where this cannot be done. So, where the eligibility for the bursary is not recorded in the ILR during the academic year, that the 60-day payment would be due and the apprentice is still on programme, providers must refer to the Apprenticeship Technical Funding Guide on how to claim this bursary. Thank you, and I'll now hand over to Laverne on EPA.
Thank you, Gary. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Laverne Darling, and I'm the team leader at the Department for Education, responsible for the delivery of the reforms to endpoint assessment. I thought it would be helpful today to start by briefly setting out some of the background to the assessment reform principles before I move on to implementation and next steps. So, as I'm sure you're aware, the department has introduced reforms to improve the way apprenticeship assessment is delivered, and these changes are part of government's continued commitment to delivering greater value and better experience for apprentices and employers. And this goes hand in hand with maintaining the high standards that define the apprenticeship programme. So these reforms build on a comprehensive review of endpoint assessment that was undertaken last year by the department, IFATE as was, Ofqual, the Office for Students, and was undertaken in close collaboration with sector stakeholders. So while the review found that apprenticeships continue to deliver strong outcomes and enjoy high satisfaction levels, feedback from the sector highlighted that endpoint assessment process can be overly complex and time-consuming. So in response to this, during National Apprenticeship Week in February, the department announced a new set of apprenticeship assessment principles which guide the redesign of assessment to better reflect the needs of employers and apprentices. So as outlined on the slide, these reforms are being introduced to deliver improvements to apprenticeship assessment, so enabling more delivery flexibility. So for example, this may mean where appropriate that assessment can happen while on programme rather than all at the end of the assessment, so that it's happening at the right time and place. Also, to deliver better value and a better experience for both apprentices and employers, we're ensuring that assessment is more proportionate to the competency being tested, and so that apprentices are really being assessed on what matters most to employers. And finally, in no particular order, the revised assessments will retain the current high levels of rigour and quality. However, where appropriate, training providers will be able to deliver elements of assessment, with endpoint assessment organisations continuing to ensure the validity of outcomes. So as I'm sure you're aware, Skills England, working in collaboration with the department, Ofqual and OFS, is leading on this whole-scale revision to all assessment plans. So moving on, we thought it would be helpful to outline how roles and responsibilities will be shaped for the revised assessment plans. Some elements will remain consistent with the current process, and also the rules for endpoint assessment. So, for example, endpoint assessment organisations will still be responsible for both developing the assessment materials, and external quality assurance will continue to be provided by the relevant regulatory body. However, there are some important changes to note. So firstly, to reduce duplication of assessment, employers will now assess and confirm that apprentices are demonstrating the requisite behaviours for a particular standard, while providers and EPOs will focus on assessing the essential knowledge and skills. So the revised assessment plans will also clarify who should conduct the assessment, whether this is the endpoint assessment organisation or the provider. And finally, where providers are assessing skills and knowledge on programme, endpoint assessment organisations will still need to ensure appropriate quality assurance is in place, aligned with the regulatory requirements. So moving on a little bit to implementation, as I've already referenced, Skills England are responsible for implementing these reforms, and we understand will, if not already, be consulting various stakeholders, including assessment organisations, providers, employers, and professional bodies. And this is in relation to the assessment plans for 5 initial test cases. Since the reforms were announced in February, we've been working very closely with Skills England, Ofqual and OFS to refine the policy for the revised assessment plans, and especially to ensure employer confidence with these, so that occupational competence is maintained whilst aligning with the published principles. So we understand the engagement that Skills England is planning should also offer further information on clarity around timelines, process and roles and responsibilities. We also understand that Skills England will publish detail of how the new policy will be implemented on their website in due course. Aligned with this, we're also in discussion with Skills England on transition expectations, recognising the notice periods needed to allow assessment organisations and training providers to prepare for these changes. And then moving on to my final slide, as outlined previously, these changes are being introduced gradually. Obviously, we've got over almost 700 standards that Skills England need to review, and they are developing, and subsequently they will be publishing revised assessment plans for all standards on a case-by-case basis. So as a result of this coming year will see a period of transition. So whilst assessment plans are being rewritten, a dual process for apprenticeship assessment will be in place. So I think that the key takeaway probably for yourselves is for apprenticeship assessments where the assessment plan has not yet been revised, the existing plan should continue to be used, and the process and rules for endpoint assessment will remain as currently is and as set out in the funding rules. Once assessment plans for standards have been revised and published by Skills England, and assessment organisations have then been able to develop revised assessments, the key funding rule change, as outlined in Annex B of the funding rules, which we published in May, is that providers must engage an assessment organisation at the start of the apprenticeship, and as is now, negotiating a price with the assessment organisation that reflects the role each party in the delivery of the assessment will play, noting that for some standards, providers will be able to take some elements of assessment. So the rationale for this is that under the new plans, with providers being able to undertake aspects, hence that's why it's important that organisations are engaged at the start. What will remain the same is that the cost of the apprenticeship must not exceed the current 20% of the funding band maximum. Similarly, if the overall price of the apprenticeship is more than the funding band maximum, then, as is the case now, the employer must pay in full the difference between the band maximum and the total negotiated price. So in terms of next steps, my team are currently drafting a companion document which we aim to publish later in the summer, and we're hoping this will provide practical guidance to support employers, training providers and assessment organisations in delivering and assessing apprentices in line with the published principles, whilst also reflecting the new condensed assessment plans. And we're hoping this will ensure that all stakeholders are aware of their roles and responsibilities and the steps needed to prepare for implementation and delivery. We also expect that the forthcoming engagement with which Skills England are planning will also highlight some of the areas of key interest to stakeholders, particularly with regards to the transition period between existing and new assessment plans. I hope that's provided some further insight around the revision to assessment plans, and as I've said, we will be producing a companion document which will provide more insight into this. So thank you for your time, and I will now hand over to Laura.
Thank you, Laverne. So we are now on to Annex A, which is right at the back of the funding rules. So we're nearly at the end of the sort of formal slide presentation, but just wanted to highlight that we've not made any significant changes to Annex A this year, but we have clarified some of the wording. And we've also made a couple of policy clarifications. So Annex A, as I'm sure you know, is all to do with the residency criteria for eligibility for funding. And we've changed the wording here to make it clear that those with pre-settled status through the EU settlement scheme are eligible for funding. So pre-settled status is now automatically extended by the Home Office, so it doesn't expire. And in addition, those with pre-settled status may be granted settled status automatically. The Home Office have changed their processes in response to a judicial review, and as this status doesn't expire, people with it would be able to complete their apprenticeship in the time available, and they are therefore eligible for funding, provided obviously that they meet all the other relevant criteria. We've also clarified that asylum seekers are not eligible for funding because a provider can't determine if an asylum seeker has enough time on their residency and is able to complete the apprenticeship before their claim has been determined. And that's because a provider won't know how long the claim process will take. So this means that even in cases where an asylum seeker has permission to work, they are not eligible for funding. But once an individual's claim has been finally determined, then they may be funded in accordance with that status. So, for example, as a refugee. So just moving on to the final slide, we just wanted to highlight a few of the next steps. So the latest rules will come into effect for starts from the 1st of August this year, unless we've specifically stated otherwise within a particular section of the rules. I've just popped on there a link that you can use for any queries that you might have. So hopefully that would be useful. And then we already know that we're going to need to make a further update to the rules. I think John mentioned this in his introduction. So we'll be needing to issue a version 2 to reflect some of the things that we already know about. So, for example, the changes to the funding of Level 7 apprenticeships from January 2026 will need to be included in that update. We currently have references within the funding rules to IFATE, and that's because the legislation to sort of create Skills England hadn't been officially passed when we issued version 1 of the rules, and we were unable to kind of preempt the outcome of that legislation. So we now need to update those references to reflect Skills England. And then obviously we always look at the feedback and questions that we get on the rules. And if there is anything that comes up where we think we need to clarify things further, then we will do so as part of that version 2. So I think that's it from me. So I'll hand back over to Nick, who's going to take us through the next part of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Just on version 2, do we know when that's likely to be, Laura or John?
Is John coming in? Oh,
yes, I'm happy to come in on that, Laura. So we, as Laura said, we already know we need to do a version 2 for the reasons we explained. That version 2 we expect to be published probably in the late autumn. We want to give as much time as possible around the implementation of Level 7. What I would say, though, is that depending on how this call goes today and other feedback we get, we may choose to do another update sooner if we feel it's necessary to do that. We want to ensure that people have got enough time to prepare, enough information to be able to do things in the right way. So if we do need to do things sooner, we will do.
Okay, thank you. And I think it's helpful if people have got any thoughts or insights about, what comments about the funding rules, they can add them into the questions, so that obviously you'll take those questions away, so you'll be able to see those thoughts as well. So please do that. But listen, thank you, John, Laura, Karen, Laverne, and Gary for your inputs today. That was a really detailed insight into the changes. Big thanks for doing that and sharing that. That was great. Okay, so we'll have a look at some of the questions, and thanks guys for putting in all the questions in there. We've got quite a few, so we'll try and get through as many of the questions, as many of the topics as we can. Okay, so panel, if you're ready for some questions, I'll start. Karen, can I come to you first with a question about the existing templates? So will any of the existing templates be updated to include the new funding rules? And they're especially looking at the off-the-job training hours in that one.
So we will be obviously updating the training plan template. We know not obviously everybody uses that, but we will update the one that we've got online. We will need to sort of look at the off-the-job guide. Obviously, the current policy and the current guide are still relevant for continuing learners, but we will put together something similar for new learners. And I think the other thing that's of immediate interest to people is the RPL guidance, and just how the off-the-job minimum hours sort of fit alongside how you sort of document RPL and things like that. So that's a task that's kind of in hand at the minute as well. Not planning on updating the calculator, because obviously the calculator is the calculator, and that's fine for existing learners. Not planning on updating the apprenticeship agreement, because I don't think we need any changes there either.
Cool, thank you. John, got a couple of questions for you. One is just I think a question about when employers and providers can expect to hear more about the new growth and skills levy.
Yes, so obviously the changes we've made this year are very much focused on improving flexibilities in apprenticeships. We think they're welcome. We think that they offer a great opportunity particularly for young people in terms of foundation apprenticeships, and responding to a lot of feedback over many years around changes around English and maths, and also shorter duration apprenticeships. But clearly the Growth and Skills Levy needs to encompass more than just apprenticeships. I'd expect the next phase of the changes that we make will be focusing on areas of the Growth and Skills Levy other than apprenticeships. That will be a key part of the work that we will commence in summer through to Christmas. I would expect that we'll be looking to consider and approach ministers about what other things we should be including in funding for the Growth and Skills Levy. I would expect that will look something like the existing Skills Bootcamps programme, but also I would expect that building on modules of apprenticeships that are available now, it may be that in certain sectors we look to sort of build on that approach, taking existing modules within apprenticeships and making those fundable as standalone. But a lot of work to be done with ministers in terms of determining what they want this to do, and also a big dependency on the spending review, which of course is happening today. So it's too early to be very definitive, but certainly we're very keen to move on the conversation and the Growth and Skills Levy to encompass a lot more than just apprenticeships.
Yeah, I think the spending review is happening. If it's not happened already, it's happening at the same time as the webinar today. So yeah, so we'll maybe we'll get some more information about that as we leave the webinar and pick up the news. Another question, John, if we can. Question here about, are there any plans to allow people on skilled worker visas to access funding with less than 3 years residency?
Laura touched on the Annex A, which is the part of the rules that covers eligibility. We are working and continue to work very closely with the Home Office and with Skills England around eligibility associated with visa status and immigration. We're not planning to make any changes around the 3-year residency, but obviously we'll keep those rules under review. They're very much driven in part by Home Office policy in that respect.
Okay, cool, thank you. And then again for you, John, there's a number of questions about level 7s, and I know sort of level 7 will probably feature in further iterations of the funding rules. But the one, or a couple of questions here that if I can go through those. This one's multi-part. So, are there any exceptions to the no level 7 over 22 years old rule? Any plans to introduce changes like this for other levels of apprenticeships, and will level 7s be available above this age range if funded outside of the levy? Let's start with those for the time being.
Okay, so there are a small group of individuals who will still be eligible. Those are those that are aged 22 to 24 with education, health and care plan. They will be able to access level 7. In terms of the availability of level 7s, the level 7s will still be available, but they won't be funded. And in terms of what this means for sort of other standards, other levels going forward, then our focus has been around level 7. The reason we've changed level 7 is around ensuring that we are, and I think it's sort of noteworthy that we have allowed 16 to 21-year-olds to still be funded for level 7. That clearly links very closely to the government's opportunity mission. And so I think that, again, a lot of this will depend on what the spending review gives us today. Affordability will be, a factor as you would expect it to be. But opportunity and growth, those opportunity and growth missions are the key missions that we're working on. And I'd expect that apprenticeships will stay very much aligned with those missions.
Okay, and then just one more question about level 7, if I can. Just what date is it in January that the level 7 changes take effect? Can we just confirm that now?
I don't think we set a date just yet, Nick, but obviously we'll want to publish the updates to the funding rules as soon as we can, once we've worked through the detail.
Okay.
John, it's 1st of January.
Thank you, Gary.
Okay.
26. Yeah.
Okay. And then again, I think another couple for you, John, if I can. If a 16 to 18-year-old learner completes in less than 12 months, but the published duration is 12 months or more,
Yes.
it seems fair that for the second incentive payment, it seems unfair that the second incentive payment won't be made. Why is this being implemented?
Yes, thank you for that question. Um, In terms of the additional payments, we were very keen to ensure that the new foundation apprenticeships and shorter apprenticeships, which are shorter by design, that is to say, they've been officially classified as shorter duration, of which we've got 3 so far. And both foundation apprenticeships and shorter duration apprenticeships are marked clearly in LARS to identify them as shorter duration. And the reason for that is we wanted to ensure they were able to not miss out on the second payment, which is set at 12 months at the moment. So this is to enable foundation and shorter apprenticeships to access that payment. Now, what that does mean is that if somebody completes an apprenticeship which isn't a foundation apprenticeship or a shorter by design apprenticeship, so one that's not formally got a duration of less than 12 months, then that second payment, if they complete before 12 months, they won't be able to access. Of course, you would expect that in the vast majority of cases for young people, actually a 12-month duration was probably still the best route for them. They're new to work. And if you are going to deliver and the duration of the apprenticeship is still 12 months or more, then you would still be able to receive that second payment. So it won't disappear completely. It's there if you stay in the program for 12 months. So it is only if that individual achieves between month 8 and month 12 that they wouldn't receive that second payment. But as I say, that's about on a positive sort of route. That was about making sure that those on foundation apprenticeships and those on formally shorter apprenticeships were not disadvantaged.
Cool. I think it was you, John, that was mentioning earlier on who'd been involved in sort of the preparation of the funding rules and the organisations and stakeholders that you'd talk to.
Yes.
Were any employer providers involved in that change? And just, I think for everybody's benefit, there are employers that also act as the training provider for their apprentices, so they sit
Yes.
in a special category where they're doing both aspects of the journey.
Yes, the very largest employer provider, the Army, we spoke to them about the funding rules changes, and we continue to engage with them, and indeed employer providers are a really important part of the programme. I'd expect that we will be doing further engagement with different groups around the funding rules, and certainly going forward we'll want to engage with employers and providers to make sure that the rules for 25-26 version 2 and beyond and into 26-27 are as effective as they can be, clear as they can be.
Cool, thank you. Karen, I've got quite a few questions on off-the-job training, so if I start working through some of those, if I can. So the first one that came in was around, well, it was English and Maths. So are English and Maths study not counted as off-the-job training hours?
So not the standalone qualification. So they've never been part of the off-the-job hours. So that's always been part of the excluded activities in the funding rules. Obviously, if you're doing something as part of a KSB, depending on the standard, there might be some knowledge, skills and behaviour units that lend themselves to that type of activity. But what we're talking about in terms of excluded activities is the standalone qualifications.
Okay. Then another one around functional skills. If the active learning has been placed on the training plan for months, for example, 1, 3 and 5, does this mean funds should only be claimed in those months and not as a block of, say, 6 consecutive months?
No, it doesn't. So you would still continue to claim the English and Maths payment, but that's why it's really important for us to understand when you're delivering it. I mean, the only other option would have been to put people on breaks and learning, which would have been, quite frankly, administrative nightmare for everybody. So that's why we decided to go with the training plan. But we just need to be really clear that you do need to be really clear in your training plan when you're planning to deliver English and Maths, because that's what the auditor is going to be looking for evidence for. So just be really clear from the outset when that planned activity is going to be done.
Yeah, because I think the next question I think is along the same sort of lines, isn't it? So it's about active engagement, off-the-job training split from English and maths. How would you treat a learner that's only engaged in maths and English for a month or two? And the question mentions a break must be used if there's no off-the-job learning activity. But does this take account of the fact that maths and English might have been delivered during this time? So I think you've covered that part, have you, in the previous response?
And I think we've structured the funding rules thinking of that question. I think we have covered that in the funding rules about, I mean, I think Laura mentioned it as well earlier, that really the active learning for off the job and the active learning for English and maths are completely separate now. So previously we treated active learning as either or activity, but because of the change in the English and maths policy, they've been completely separated. So those two active learning rules have to be managed independently, and there is information in each of those sections about what to do, when to do it, and also what to do if you're not planning activity, for either of those two things. So I think I would just refer people to the funding rules. Obviously, if there's still a question, contact the service desk and we'll pick it up that way.
Cool. And there's a couple of questions about the diagnostic assessments for English and maths. So one says, in relation to maths and English, when you say a 19+ apprentice is no longer required to complete a diagnostic assessment, are they still required to complete the maths and English initial assessment even when opting out?
So if they're opting out, I think Laura covered this on a slide. If the decision is made, if they're 19+ and they're opting out, there's no requirement to sort of provide evidence of their prior attainment or do a diagnostic or anything, because the provider's not setting a benchmark to where that person is starting from, because they're not actually going to be doing that activity. So yeah, I think again, if this particular question on a particular learner, because this feels like it might be a specific learner question, contact the service desk and we'll deal with individual learner circumstances that way, I think.
Cool.
If I can just add a little bit more to that one, Nick.
Please.
Obviously, English and maths, it can be part of the apprenticeship as well as being separate as part of functional skills. So it might be, and this is back to the sort of individual circumstance, that it makes common sense for there to be an initial assessment on English and maths if there is a particularly intensive element of English and maths already embedded within the standard. So I'm thinking about some of the, for example, accountancy ones, or the engineering and manufacturing ones, or some of the science-based ones. It might be appropriate to do that, just to check that the apprentice has got the capability to be able to undertake the apprenticeship. So that might be some of the rationale there. It's not compulsory, but it might be the sort of rationale that's being used there.
Okay, cool. Thank you. 2 seconds while I find place. So we got a couple of questions about sort of minimum duration of 8 months. Who on the panel can answer me a couple of questions on minimum duration? So we've got a question: does the minimum duration changing to 8 months apply to new starts only, or
Yes.
also as well?
Yeah, so it's new starts only from the 1st of August. So continuing learners, anybody who's recruited up until the 31st of July, restarts, all of those people would have to have a minimum duration for the existing policy of 12 months. It's only brand new starts from the 1st of August 25.
Okay, thank you. And just bear in mind, I've just lost my space on the questions. Bear with me just 2 seconds. Okay, so I'm just having to scroll down to where I was. The questions pane just disappeared on me.
While you're just doing that, Nick, sorry, there was a point of clarification I wanted to make in relation to a question I answered earlier. I did say the apprenticeship agreement wouldn't need to be updated. And we have had some comments back in to say, obviously, in the notes page, it does refer to the 12 months. So obviously, that bit, the notes page, would need to be updated. The template itself, in terms of what we ask for as part of the apprenticeship agreement, wouldn't need to be updated. But yes, the notes page technically will. So I just wanted to clarify that. So thank you for the people who pointed that out. I thought it did say minimum duration, but it does actually say 12 months.
Thank you, Karen, for neatly filling where I was struggling to get my question pane back up. So that was really handy for you to do that. John, question for you: is it okay for the employer to fund their 19+ apprentices to take English and Maths outside of the apprenticeship? If we exclude it from the training plan, NHS employers often ask if they can do this through their own arrangements.
The answer is yes, but it would have to be privately funded, because it's not possible to be double funded from another part of the education forest to do this. So you couldn't, for example, use some of the 16 to 19 funding in FE alongside the apprenticeship. That would be double funding. There is obviously this choice to opt in or opt out of English and Maths, and the funding is available within the apprenticeship programme to cover that. So it'd have to be privately funded for that to happen. Of course, you could choose to, if you wanted to, do the two things consecutively. So you could be funded to do the English and Maths prior to doing the apprenticeship.
Okay, thanks, John. And Karen, there's a point of clarification asking why is duration specified in months and not weeks?
We've always had a 12-month minimum duration, and therefore when we obviously made the change, we chose to use calendar months. Yeah, so I mean, there's no other reason other than that, really. I mean, when it comes to doing sort of validation rules and things in the ILR, there is a number of days that equates to, but for the purposes of describing the programme, we've always used months, so full calendar months, just to avoid kind of, I think it's probably just easier just to explain it in that way, sort of full calendar months, but yeah, obviously that has an equivalent number of days in the ILR.
Cool. And then another couple to you again, Karen, if I can. This is again about typical durations. Where are they, or where will they be published? Or where does that come from? Will this be taken from Skills England or LARS?
Sorry, I haven't seen that question. So does that mean the typical duration that's on the front of a standard?
So yeah, so the full question is, where will the published typical standards come from? Will this be taken from Skills England or LARS? And it relates then to it's essential for when it comes to Rule 104.2.1.
Oh, you're testing my knowledge as to what that is, unless I've got the front in front of me. So sorry, if we're talking about sort of typical durations, then generally the way I have generally set them is working with the Trailblazer group, who have outlined how long that they feel it takes to achieve full competence, and that's where the typical duration comes from on the front of a standard now. Obviously, that's always ever been a guide, because it's just about one way a programme can be delivered. So we've never measured anybody in relation to that typical duration before. We've only ever measured the statutory minimum duration to make sure that it's a compliant programme, because like I said earlier, we've got that many different ways of people delivering programmes, front loading and compression. Obviously, the typical duration on the front of a standard tends to lend itself more to a linear sort of day release type model. And if you're doing a lot of front loading, you're generally going to compress that delivery down. But the important thing is that you don't go below, obviously, the statutory minimum duration of either 12 months now or 8 months in the future. So that's the important distinction between the two.
Cool, thank you. And then a question here, I'm not sure where this is coming from, but I'll ask it anyway. And this is, will apprentices still need to upload off-the-job evidence on a regular basis?
Yeah, so everything else about off-the-job training isn't changing. So how we define it, what's in and out in terms of eligible activities, the fact that we expect the provider to manage that, even if it's somebody else who's delivering it, the evidence requirements for it, none of that is changing. So all of the existing rules were kind of carried forward into the 25-26 document in terms of evidence arrangements. In fact, I think we actually made it stronger, the fact that it's the responsibility of the person receiving the funding, so the main provider or the employer provider in this case, whoever's receiving the money from us in the first place, it's their responsibility for collecting all of the evidence, even if they haven't delivered the training. So they are responsible for collecting in learner logs, if it's the learner who's done it, or subcontractor information, So it is all on that main provider. So I think we did make that bit stronger. But generally everything else in terms of the definition, the fact it has to be done within normal working hours, all of that stuff, none of that has changed.
Cool. And again, following on, so for some more questions for you, Karen, would you still expect active learning every month with the new flexibilities?
So the active learning rule is still in place. So it's every month unless it's a front-loaded or block release model, and that's defined in the funding rules. And then it can be something every quarter. So again, that bit was rolled forward. I mean, we are constantly looking at the whole policy. That is something we know people you don't necessarily like about the policy, but we do pay out on a monthly basis, so we do need to understand that the learner is getting something on a frequent basis as well. I mean, the flexibility in relation to sort of duration, in terms of it not now going hand in hand with the volume of training, that's kind of separate to the fact that we still need the learner to have done at least something every month. And that can be quite minimal, and it doesn't need to be provider led. But we thought that active learning rule is still in place.
Cool, thank you. And a question about RPL. So can we get any confirmation that RPL, that we can RPL below the published minimum? Let me start that again. Can we get confirmation that we can RPL below the published minimum off the job hours for each standard, as long as we don't go below the 8 months?
Yeah, so I can confirm that. That is in the funding rules, but what we are working on, myself and my colleague Peter, we are working on updating the RPL guidance, because we know the examples in there need to be kind of obviously further fleshed out in relation to the off the job minimum requirements. So to be clear, what we still need from the provider is still a documentation of what your planned hours are, and that might be way above what the minimum requirement is. So almost set that to one side for a second, because the planned and actual hours is about what you as a provider are delivering to that learner, and your delivery model might be completely different to somebody else's delivery model. So we need to understand the different delivery models and how long things are taken, how long a standard is taken. So just because we've produced a minimum requirement for a standard, we don't expect that's what everyone is going to be delivering for that standard. That has been set below average for a start, and it's only representative of a delivery model of how a standard can be delivered. If you deliver significantly more than that minimum requirement, we still need to know that. So your planned hours will stay the same as what your planned hours are now. In terms of what the auditor will look for, though, when they come out and do a funding audit, instead of kind of what they would look at now would be obviously 20% or 6 hours a week of the however long the person is on programme for, what the auditor will look for is what the standards minimum hours are, and they will discount any RPL as well, and then that's their new baseline for that learner. So the two things are slightly different, and we will clarify that in the RPL guidance. I know we're getting a lot of questions online about that at the minute. So we will flesh that out and put some examples in just to help clarify and just sort of pictorial sort of demonstrate what that means, like what we expect the information is to be recorded from people. So that is something we are currently working on. We will try and get that out as soon as possible.
Cool. Thank you. John, there's a question here about when will Skills England begin transitioning standards?
So Skills England obviously transitioned from IFE, and their work hasn't stopped. It's kept going. So they're continuing to look at standards now, both new ones coming forward and refreshes. There's a sort of an existing pipeline of activity. In terms of assessment plans, I think perhaps they may be thinking about assessment plans, and we're looking at all 700 standards. We'll be looking at the refreshing assessment plans. We're going to prioritise working with Skills and which ones to look at. We'll be looking to prioritise the ones with the highest volume of learners first and foremost. We've got 180 that we're looking to prioritise within the first year of activity. But it will be very much a gradual thing in terms of the implementation of assessment plans. I would expect that we'll have some new assessment plans come on stream during 25-26, but the vast majority of learners are probably going to be using the existing endpoint assessment approach for the majority for 25-26, given that the assessment plans are going to be in development for some time.
Okay. There's still quite a few questions about off-the-job training, which I think there's a couple about the list of the 13 standards. So will the list of 13 standards still likely to be revised or be published? So is there any comments that you want to make on the 13 standards, Karen, while I scroll through some questions?
So yeah, so we're in individual discussions, and each standard is different. Like the reason why it might not be appropriate at the level that we set it at. So that's why we haven't published the list. But what I would say is that we're working on that literally kind of today and tomorrow. So any changes that we do make will come out imminently. So I know people have kind of said it would be useful to know if we deliver that standard. You will know that very soon, literally next week. If a standard is going to be kind of revised, that information will be coming out imminently. So I would just say maybe hang fire, and obviously still continue to sort of feed into your sector rep if the standard that you haven't talked to us about already, you've got an issue with, and we will obviously look at that, as and when we get that information.
Cool. And then one last question for you at the moment, Karen. We talked about Annex C, and so there's a question asking for clarification about which document the off-the-jobs examples are in, because this person can't see Annex C in the funding rules.
So Annex C is actually it's a separate document. It's a spreadsheet. So on the funding rules page for 25-26, there's the funding rules document. There's the summary of changes, and then the third document is the annex. I think it's actually technically called off the job minimum hours. I'm not sure Annex C is actually in the title on the gov.uk page. It's only actually in the document itself. We've called it Annex C. Because we've obviously got Annex A and B in the main document. We kept it separate. Two reasons. Well, one, it's a spreadsheet, so it didn't really lend itself to being included in the funding rules. But also we knew Annex C would probably have to be updated on a more frequent basis, and we didn't want multiple versions of the funding rules, because every time literally we update a batch of standards, we're going to have to update Annex C until those hours start to appear on the standards at some future point. So that's why it's being kept separate. But it is that third document on the funding rules page. That's what we mean by Annex C.
Okay, I've got a link to that on the handout document as well. So when we get to that point in a couple of minutes' time, I'll tell you where to go to download the handout, so you can get a copy of the link for that. Okay, if we can move on, have a look at very quickly some foundation apprenticeship questions. Charlotte, can I bring you in at this point? Why was it decided that foundation apprenticeships would be education level 2 rather than, for example, level 1 or below?
Yep, thank you. So the content for foundation apprenticeships really has been designed to cover a much broader foundation occupation, and that it has been set at level 2. And in the design of those standards, some of the content has been drawn from existing level 2 apprenticeship standards. So whilst the learners might not be getting as much depth as those current level 2s, they're getting more breadth. And then we're adding in those additional elements to it. So the employability skills, for example. So it's having content that is already at a level 2 and then adding in existing additional content as well.
Okay, where can people find the list of foundation apprenticeships?
So they're published now on Skills England's website on the Apprenticeship Finder page, and there's a box on the left-hand side of that page where you can filter specifically by foundation apprenticeships, and they'll all be listed there. Okay,
and then sort of going back to the off-the-job thing for a second, but in relation to foundation apprenticeships, what are the off-the-job hours for foundation apprenticeships? Because the person asking the question can't see those in the funding rules or the Annex C.
Yeah, so they're listed on the standards on Skills England website. So on each standard that you go on, it will say sort of the minimum number of hours expected for that.
Okay, and then a quick question about the incentive payment for foundation apprenticeships. Are there any restrictions or specific guidance on how the incentive payments can be used by employers?
No, so the intention behind those payments are really to support employers with the additional costs of supporting a young person on that foundation apprenticeship, but we're not going to be prescriptive in what that looks like. So really it's the employer's choice how they use that payment.
Okay, cool. And then can an apprentice complete their foundation apprenticeship and then progress on to another level 2 apprenticeship?
Yeah, that's sort of what we want from these programs. We want them to be that stepping stone to progression. So yeah, learners can complete their foundation and then progress on to a level 2. And obviously the content that they would have covered in the foundation will be taken into account on that next one. So yeah, that's the ideal route that we'll see through.
Thank you. John, can I come to you? A quick question about care leavers. So can you please clarify the definition of a care leaver and someone still in care?
Yeah, so in terms of funding, it's anybody with an education, health and care plan is eligible for the funding, and obviously that's the care leaver bursary fundamentally.
Okay, I'm just going to skip through a couple of questions. Thank you for that, John. Just skip through a couple of questions to try and cover some of the other areas as well. So Laverne, there's a couple of questions about endpoint assessment. When are changes to endpoint assessment expected to be ready to go?
So as John has just outlined, we're expecting the changes to be quite gradual. And as I said, as part of my presentation, we are currently working with Skills England, Ofqual and OFS in terms of further developing the policy and process and what this means for implementation. So in terms of, I've seen another question on transition. We appreciate that, for example, if a revised assessment plan is published on the 1st of September, that providers and assessment organisations will not be in a position to deliver that from the 2nd of April. So we know there will be a transition period. And these are all the matters that we're currently working up and we're aiming to include in the companion document. So what I would ask of everybody is, firstly, thank you for the questions you've raised, because these will certainly help us to develop the companion doc that my team are leading on, but also if you route any questions through the employer trailblazer groups responsible for a particular standard, we're also going to be working closely with the Association of Employment and Learning Providers from a provider aspect for some of the issues or concerns they have, and similarly with the Federation of Awarding Bodies. So we do appreciate that we can't provide a lot of clarity at the moment, but we will be doing so over the coming months.
Okay, I think we probably need to close the question session now because we're now slightly over time, but I've got just a couple more slides to run through. So thank you, guys. Thank you for posting the questions, everybody. Thank you to the presenters for stepping in and fielding so many. I spent a lot of time on off-the-job training because there was by far and away more off-the-job training questions than anything else. But thank you guys for going through those and providing your insights. As I mentioned, also, yeah, we'll commit to taking away any questions that haven't been answered and get points of clarification by topic out in a few weeks' time. Okay, so just moving on very quickly then, if I can remind you about our YouTube channel at DFE Sector Comms. As you can see on the screen, we've got 3 playlists on the channel. The recording of today's session will be on the Apprenticeship Service webinar recordings playlist, and that'll be there in about 3 weeks time when we've done some accessibility stuff and added some subtitles and things to it. We've also got our apprenticeship support videos covering the different functions of the Apprenticeship Service, and they're in the Using the Apprenticeship Service playlist, and videos created to support the delivery of apprenticeships are available in the Apprenticeship Support Videos playlist. So do go along, subscribe to that channel, click on the bell icon and get alerts for when new content are uploaded. And then on this slide, we've got a few links to the places that you can go to access support. So if you look at your control panel, you should see a heading under the handouts tab. You can download the handout document now, and you'll see on there a list of all the links we've referred to. Yeah, there's quite a bit of information on there, so go and download the handouts tab now. Other ways to stay up to date include apprenticeships.gov.uk. It's a great place for employers and providers to find out more about the apprenticeships. For our training provider colleagues, there's always the Further Education and Training Providers community, which is a peer-led discussion forum. for future webinars. To register for any of our future webinars, I've included the link that you should follow. And by the end of this week, so by the end of Friday, there'll be you'll be able to access a recording of today's webinar from that link as well. So as well as YouTube, you've got that link on the GoToWebinar platform as well. If you've got any specific queries about the Apprenticeship Service, you can always go to the self-service support tool, or you can email our support team as well. And again, their contact details are on the handout. And then finally, we've also listed all of the links to the funding rules documents and the apprenticeship assessment principles document there as well. So that's it. That brings us to the end of the session. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to the presenters, and thanks for all the insights they've shared during the Q&A session. And remember, as you leave the webinar, please complete the short survey. And that just leaves me to say bye, everybody, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you very much. Bye.